The first Christmas gift my parents handed out that morning wasn't wrapped in festive paper. It was my condo keys. My mother stood in the middle of the living room beside the Christmas tree, smiling proudly as she dropped the spare key onto my younger brother Ethan's open palm. "Merry Christmas," she announced. "Now you finally have a place to start over." Everyone applauded, except me. My aunt smiled politely because she thought she had missed part of the conversation. My cousins looked back and forth between Ethan and me, trying to understand why I hadn't reacted. Ethan grinned like a man who had just won the lottery. "Thanks, Mom," he said, closing his fingers around the keys. "I'll start moving in after lunch." Nobody asked me whether I agreed. Nobody even looked at me. According to my parents, the decision had already been made. Before I tell you what happened next, let me say something to anyone who's ever watched family members volunteer something that belonged to them. The hardest part isn't losing money. It's realizing the people closest to you never believed they needed your permission in the first place. If you've ever dealt with a golden child, entitled relatives, or family members who confused generosity with ownership, you'll understand exactly why I stayed calm that Christmas morning. Because while everyone else was celebrating a gift that wasn't theirs to give, I was thinking about an appointment already sitting on my calendar for 9 o'clock the next morning. My name is Olivia Parker, and I bought my downtown condo 6 years earlier with money I earned myself. No inheritance, no family loan, no secret investor. I worked as a financial analyst for nearly a decade, saved every annual bonus, lived with roommates until I turned 29, and skipped vacations most of my friends considered normal. When I finally signed the closing papers, my parents congratulated me publicly while quietly reminding everyone that family helped raise a daughter responsible enough to buy property. What they never mentioned was that they hadn't contributed a single dollar toward the down payment. That detail rarely fit the version of events they preferred telling relatives during holidays. Ethan's life followed a very different path. He wasn't lazy, at least not intentionally. He simply grew up believing someone would always rescue him before consequences became permanent. My parents paid off his student loans after he changed college majors 3 times. They covered credit card balances he promised never to repeat. They let him move back home whenever another job wasn't the right fit. And they somehow managed to describe every setback as proof the world failed to appreciate his potential. Whenever I questioned whether constantly solving Ethan's problems actually helped him, my mother always gave the same answer. "One day you'll understand, because you're the older sister." Somehow, being responsible had slowly become another obligation instead of an achievement. This Christmas gathering was supposed to be simple. My parents invited 23 relatives for lunch, exchanged gifts before noon, and planned the usual afternoon of board games, desserts, and family photos. I arrived carrying homemade pecan pie and a small present for Ethan, a professional portfolio case I hoped might help during future job interviews. He had been unemployed for nearly 8 months after leaving another sales position, insisting management didn't respect creativity. I genuinely wanted him to succeed. I just never imagined my parents' solution would involve giving him property they didn't own. Looking back now, I wonder whether they rehearsed the moment before I arrived, or whether they truly believed I would smile, hug Ethan, and hand over my home without asking a single question. After the applause faded, my mother finally looked at me as though expecting gratitude. "Olivia," she said warmly, "isn't this exciting? Ethan can finally get back on his feet." I glanced at the key in my brother's hand before answering. "Mom, that's the spare key to my condo." She laughed softly. Of course it is. We had copies made after you gave us one for emergencies. My father stepped in before I could continue. Your place is closer to downtown, he explained. You work from home most of the week anyway. Ethan needs it more right now. I waited for someone to acknowledge the obvious fact that none of them actually owned the property. No one did. Around the room, relatives avoided eye contact, clearly sensing the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Ethan finally spoke, sounding almost embarrassed. I told them maybe they should ask you first. My mother waved the comment away immediately. Families don't need contracts to help each other. Normally, I might have reminded her that families also don't transfer real estate through Christmas presents. But something stopped me. Years working in finance had taught me that the strongest position isn't always the loudest one. I simply asked, "When exactly were you planning to tell me?" My father answered without hesitation, "We figured we'd all discuss it today." I looked around the room, filled with people quietly pretending to study wrapping paper, coffee cups, and ornaments, instead of the conversation unfolding in front of them. Apparently, discussion meant announcing a decision after everyone else had already accepted it. I reached into my purse, unlocked my phone, and opened my calendar. The reminder waiting there had been scheduled nearly 6 weeks earlier. 9:00 a.m., closing appointment. I looked back at my parents and smiled politely. "That's interesting," I said. What is?" my mother asked. "The way I sold the condo." The room went completely silent. Ethan stared at me. "God," my father frowned. "Honey." My mother actually laughed. "Dad, very funny," she said. "Luh." I slipped my phone back into my purse. I'm not joking. There. Then I picked up my coffee, and the buyers are signing the final papers tomorrow morning. For several seconds, nobody spoke. My mother's smile remained on her face, but it had become the kind people wear when they're waiting for someone to admit a joke has gone too far. My father looked at me as though he expected me to laugh next. Ethan glanced down at the spare key still resting in his hand before looking back at me. "Olivia," he said carefully, "you're serious?" I nodded once, completely. The room had been filled with Christmas music only moments earlier, but now even the children decorating cookies in the kitchen seemed quieter. Finally, my mother gave a short laugh and shook her head. "You almost had me," she said. "Now, tell everyone the truth." I reached into my purse, removed a neatly folded folder, and placed it on the coffee table beside the Christmas cookies. The first page wasn't a deed or a bank statement. It was a purchase agreement bearing my signature and the buyer's. Across the top in bold letters were 2 words my parents had clearly never expected to see: pending closing. My father picked up the papers first. His expression changed almost immediately as he skimmed the first page, then the second. "You listed the condo?" he asked quietly. 5 weeks ago, I replied. "The inspection was completed 2 weeks ago. Financing was approved last Thursday. Tomorrow morning we close unless something unexpected happens." My mother's face slowly lost all color. "Why didn't you tell us?" she demanded. I answered honestly, "Because it never came up." She stared at me in disbelief. "You're selling your home and didn't think your family deserved to know?" I almost smiled at the irony of the question. "Mom," I said gently, "apparently my family believed they could give it away without telling me." Compared to that, selling my own property seems like a fairly ordinary decision. Ethan carefully placed the spare key back on the coffee table. Unlike my parents, he no longer looked excited. Mostly, he looked confused. "Where are you moving?" he asked. "A townhouse closer to my office," I answered. "I've been renovating it for the last month." That surprised nearly everyone in the room because I had deliberately kept the project quiet. Not out of secrecy, but because experience had taught me something valuable. Every major financial decision I shared with my parents somehow became a family discussion instead of a personal choice. When I bought the condo, they insisted I should have purchased something larger so Ethan could stay with me if necessary. When I refinanced during lower interest rates, they asked whether I could add my brother to the title someday to make things easier. Each request sounded harmless by itself. Together, they revealed a pattern I had ignored for far too long. My Aunt Carol finally broke the silence. "Linda," she said carefully to my mother, "did Olivia know you planned to give Ethan her keys today?" My mother folded her arms. "We knew she'd understand once we explained." Aunt Carol frowned. "But you didn't explain. You announced it." Several relatives quietly nodded without saying anything. For years, family gatherings had followed an unspoken rule. Nobody challenged my parents publicly because doing so usually created more drama than staying silent. Today felt different. Perhaps seeing actual closing documents on the table made the situation impossible to dismiss as a misunderstanding. My father cleared his throat and tried to soften the conversation. "Nobody was trying to take anything away from you, Olivia. We just thought Ethan needed temporary help." I looked at him calmly. Temporary help usually begins with asking. My mother suddenly reached for the purchase agreement and flipped through the pages more quickly. "This doesn't matter yet," she said. "It isn't sold until tomorrow." I recognized that tone immediately. Effortless. Processing reality anymore. She was searching for a way around it. The buyers could still back out. I nodded. They could. Exactly. Relief briefly returned to her voice. "Then we'll call them." Several people around the room stared at her. Even Ethan looked uncomfortable. "Mom," he said quietly, "you can't call someone buying Olivia's condo." She ignored him completely. "How much are they paying?" she asked me instead. "Enough," I replied. "Who are they?" "A young couple relocating from Seattle." "Give me their number." I shook my head once. "No." The conversation ended there, because refusing to argue often frustrates controlling people far more than debating them. Lunch eventually continued, although nobody seemed particularly interested in eating. Small conversations broke out around the dining room, while relatives quietly processed what had happened. Ethan disappeared into the backyard for almost half an hour. My mother spoke in hushed tones with my father near the kitchen sink, glancing toward me every few minutes. I wasn't angry anymore. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired of every achievement eventually becoming another resource someone expected me to share. Tired of success creating obligations that never seemed to apply equally to anyone else. As I helped clear dessert plates, Aunt Carol squeezed my shoulder gently. "You know," she whispered, "your grandmother used to say generosity only counts when the owner chooses it." I smiled sadly. I wish more people remembered that. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Michelle Grant, the escrow officer handling my closing. I stepped onto the back porch before answering. "Hi, Michelle." Her voice sounded cheerful at first. "Just confirming tomorrow's appointment. Everything is ready on our end." I thanked her and was about to end the call when she hesitated. Actually, there's one small thing. My stomach tightened immediately. What's wrong? Nothing with financing, she assured me. The buyers are fully approved. She paused again. It's just that someone called our office this afternoon, claiming to be an immediate family member trying to stop the sale. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I didn't need to ask who. Michelle continued before I could respond. Don't worry, we didn't discuss your file. We simply informed the caller that only the legal owner can make decisions regarding the transaction. I looked through the kitchen window. My mother was standing exactly where I had left her. Her cell phone was still in her hand. Michelle's next sentence made my grip tighten around the phone. My care rate. One more thing, she said. The caller told us your family would be at the closing tomorrow morning. My player. I thanked Michelle for the warning, assured her I would be there on time, and ended the call before walking back inside. My mother was still standing beside the kitchen island, pretending to help wash dishes while checking her phone every few minutes. She didn't know Michelle had already called me. She probably believed the title company would panic the moment a family member claimed the seller was making a mistake. Unfortunately for her, real estate transactions don't work that way. Property law is based on ownership, not opinions. Years in finance had taught me that contracts care very little about family feelings. I slipped my phone into my purse and quietly helped my aunt stack dessert plates. My mother eventually walked over with the expression she always wore before beginning a conversation she expected everyone else to lose. Olivia, she said softly, why don't we talk upstairs for a minute? I smiled politely. We can talk here. She glanced around the dining room, where several relatives were pretending not to listen. This is a family matter. I nodded. Exactly. Everyone here is family. Her jaw tightened slightly before she lowered her voice anyway. I called the closing company because I thought they should know you were making an emotional decision. I looked directly at her. Selling my own property after 6 years of ownership isn't emotional. Giving it away without asking the owner would have been. She sighed dramatically as though I were making an easy situation difficult. You're focusing on technicalities. That sentence almost made me laugh. In my profession, technicalities determined whether companies survived audits, whether contracts remained enforceable, and whether people kept millions of dollars. Deeds, titles, and signatures weren't technicalities. They were ownership. Mom, I replied calmly, there's only one technicality that matters. My name is the only name on the deed. She folded her arms. Families don't keep score like that. Before I could answer, Aunt Carol quietly spoke from across the kitchen. Actually, Linda, county property records do. Several cousins looked down to hide smiles. My mother's face flushed immediately. She wasn't accustomed to relatives challenging her version of fairness. Ethan returned from the backyard just as the conversation ended. He looked noticeably different from earlier that afternoon. The excitement had completely disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he had become the center of a conflict he hadn't fully understood. He walked over to me while everyone else busied themselves clearing dishes. Can we talk? He asked quietly. We stepped onto the back deck where cold December air finally replaced the tension inside the house. Ethan leaned against the railing for a long moment before speaking. I didn't know they planned to announce it like that. I believed him. I know. He looked surprised by my answer. You do? I nodded. If you had planned it, you would have asked for the keys before Christmas morning. He stared down at the backyard. I honestly thought they had already talked to you. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Finally, he sighed. They're going to blame you for this. I gave a small smile. They already do. Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about one sentence Michelle had said. Your family will be at the closing tomorrow morning. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was a warning. By the time I reached my townhouse, another message was waiting on my phone from the buyer's real estate agent, confirming our appointment at 9 o'clock sharp. Everything remained on schedule. I unpacked a few boxes from the move, reviewed the final settlement statement one last time, and tried to get some sleep. Instead, my phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the night. My mother sent long text messages explaining that Christmas should be about sacrifice. My father wrote that perhaps postponing the sale for 30 days would keep the peace. Several distant relatives asked whether there had been a misunderstanding. I answered none of them. There was nothing left to explain. The next morning, I arrived at Grant Title Services 15 minutes early, carrying my identification, the closing documents Michelle had requested, and a travel mug filled with coffee. Michelle greeted me with the calm professionalism I had appreciated throughout the transaction. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Everything is ready." She led me into a private conference room where the buyers, Daniel and Rebecca Lawson, were already reviewing paperwork with their lender. They looked excited, nervous, and completely unaware that my family had apparently decided to attend someone else's real estate closing. Watching them reminded me of my own closing 6 years earlier. They weren't buying an investment. They were buying the place they planned to call home. That made me even more determined not to let unnecessary drama ruin their experience. We had signed only 3 documents when voices became audible in the reception area outside. Even through the closed conference room door, I immediately recognized my mother's voice. "That's my daughter's property," she insisted. "She isn't thinking clearly." Another voice answered politely. "Ma'am, only scheduled parties may enter the closing room." My father spoke next, sounding far more restrained. "We only want 5 minutes." Michelle looked at me apologetically. "Would you like security to escort them out?" I shook my head. "Only if they refuse to leave." She nodded and stepped outside. Through the frosted glass, I could see vague outlines of several people standing near the reception desk. There were more silhouettes than I expected. My parents hadn't come alone. A minute later, Michelle returned. They're insisting your brother has already moved into the condo." I blinked. What?" She looked down at the notes the receptionist had just handed her. "According to your mother..." Michelle hesitated. "Your family changed the locks this morning." I really found... For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood Michelle. "Changed the locks," I repeated. She nodded, looking just as confused as I felt. "Your mother told the receptionist that Ethan moved into the condo early this morning because the property now belongs to him." Daniel and Rebecca, the young couple buying the condo, looked at me with growing concern. They had walked into a title office expecting to sign papers for their first home. Instead, they were suddenly hearing about someone allegedly occupying the property they were about to purchase. I immediately turned toward them. "I'm so sorry," I said sincerely. "No one has legal possession of that condo except me, and I can explain every part of this." Daniel gave a cautious nod. "We believe you. We just want to know whether this affects the sale." Before I could answer, Michelle spoke with the confidence of someone who handled closings every day. "Ownership is determined by recorded title, not by who claims they should live there. As long as Ms. Parker signs today, the transaction remains fully enforceable. Still, one question kept bothering me. Can we verify whether anyone actually entered the condo? Michelle nodded. Of course. I stepped into the hallway and called the property management office. The building manager, Mrs. Alvarez, answered immediately because she recognized my number. Olivia, she said warmly, everything okay? I explained the situation as briefly as possible. There was a pause on the other end before she sighed. I was wondering when you were going to call. My heart sank. They came. About an hour ago, she confirmed. Your parents and a moving truck? I closed my eyes. Please tell me they didn't get inside. No, she replied, because I wouldn't let them. Relief washed over me so quickly I nearly laughed. Mrs. Alvarez continued. Your mother insisted Ethan owned the unit now. I asked for proof. They didn't have any. Then they asked maintenance to change the locks. She actually chuckled. Maintenance reminded them only the legal owner can authorize lock changes. When I returned to the conference room, everyone was waiting. They're not inside, I announced. Building management stopped them. Daniel smiled for the first time all morning. Good. Michelle made one quick note in the file before continuing the closing process. Then, let's finish what we came here to do. For the next 20 minutes, we worked steadily through disclosures, settlement statements, title insurance forms, tax prorations, and transfer documents. The routine paperwork felt strangely comforting after the chaos of the previous 24 hours. Every signature represented something simple and undeniable. Facts, dates, ownership, no family vote, no emotional speeches. Just legally binding documents prepared weeks before anyone decided my condo would make a convenient Christmas gift. We were reviewing the final deed when the conference room door opened gently. Michelle's receptionist stepped inside, looking slightly embarrassed. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but they still refuse to leave. Michelle frowned. Have they become disruptive? Not exactly, the receptionist answered. Your mother says she'll wait until Olivia changes her mind. Michelle turned toward me. Photographers. Complete you like me to contact building security? Before I could answer, Daniel quietly spoke. Actually, would you mind if they stayed outside? Everyone looked at him. He smiled awkwardly. I don't want our first memory of buying a home to involve police, if it can be avoided. I'd rather just finish. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. This young couple deserved excitement today, not drama. Let's finish, I agreed. 10 minutes later, I signed the seller's deed. Daniel and Rebecca signed the buyer's documents. The lender authorized funding electronically, and Michelle carefully reviewed each page before placing the final document into a separate folder marked Ready for Recording. She looked up and smiled. Congratulations, she said. Subject to county recording this afternoon. The property officially transfers today. Daniel reached across the table to shake my hand. Thank you, he said sincerely. We promise we'll take good care of it. I smiled back. I know you will. 6 years of memories lived inside that condo. But strangely, I didn't feel sadness watching it pass to someone else. Homes are meant to be lived in, not fought over. As we stepped into the reception area together, my parents immediately stood on. Ethan was there too, along with 2 distant relatives my mother had apparently recruited for support. My mother walked straight toward me without acknowledging the buyers. "Olivia," she said firmly, "this has gone far enough." I looked at Michelle, who quietly nodded toward the exit in case assistance became necessary. "The sale is finished," I replied. My mother's expression hardened. "You can still cancel it," Michelle answered before I could. "Actually, ma'am, she cannot. The documents have been executed and are awaiting recording." My father looked from Michelle to me. "You really went through with it?" I met his eyes. "Yes." My mother finally noticed Daniel and Rebecca standing beside me, holding their closing folders. "You two," she said, turning toward them. "There's been a misunderstanding. That's my son's home." Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply held up the folder Michelle had handed him moments earlier. "According to the title company," he replied politely, "it's our home." My mother's face reddened. "Family comes before paperwork," Rebecca answered gently but confidently. "Ma'am, my husband and I spent 3 years saving for this purchase. We didn't take anything from your family. We bought a home from its owner." For the first time since Christmas morning, someone completely outside our family said aloud what should have been obvious from the beginning. Just then, Michelle's phone rang. She listened for less than 30 seconds before smiling. "Hey." She hung up and looked directly at me. "The county just confirmed recording." She turned toward Daniel and Rebecca. "They do that. Congratulations." Then she looked back at my parents. "The property has officially changed ownership." My mother stood frozen. I felt Ethan slowly lowered his head. Quat. And for the first time since Christmas began, no one blamed me. Maybe when. The drive home from the title company should have felt satisfying, but instead it felt strangely quiet. Daniel and Rebecca now legally owned the condo. The county had recorded the deed, and every document had been executed exactly as planned. From a legal perspective, the matter was over. From a family perspective, it was only beginning. Before I even reached my townhouse, my phone lit up with message after message. My mother had apparently decided that if she couldn't stop the sale, she could at least control the story. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly wanted to know why I had made Ethan homeless. Family friends asked whether I had really sold the condo out of spite. One cousin even sent me a screenshot from Facebook where my mother had written, "Sometimes success changes people. We raised our daughter to value family, but money can harden a heart." She never mentioned that the property had belonged to me. She never mentioned announcing it as Ethan's Christmas gift without asking. She simply presented herself as a disappointed mother trying to help one child while another refused. I almost responded immediately. Then I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me whenever neighborhood arguments spread faster than facts. "Never chase a rumor," he would say. "By the time you catch it, you've already helped it travel farther." Instead of defending myself online, I called the only 2 people whose opinions actually mattered regarding the property: Daniel and Rebecca. "I just wanted to check on you," I said. "Has anyone contacted you?" Daniel laughed softly. "Actually, yes." My stomach tightened. My mother. She left a voicemail asking us to reconsider the purchase because Christmas miracles happen. I couldn't help smiling despite everything. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca answered before Daniel could. "Please don't apologize for someone else's decisions. We're changing the locks this afternoon and looking forward to moving in." That simple sentence reminded me exactly why I had sold the condo in the first place. It was no longer part of my life. The people living there deserved peace, not a family dispute they never chose. The following morning, I arrived at work expecting awkward conversations. Instead, my coworkers greeted me exactly as they always had. Apparently, adulthood contains an unexpected gift outside your family. Most people simply respect property rights. During lunch, my friend and colleague Vanessa asked how the closing went. I gave her the short version. She listened quietly before asking one question. Did your parents ever help pay the mortgage? No. Property taxes? No. HOA fees? No. She shrugged. Then I'm struggling to understand the controversy. We both laughed because, stripped of emotional language, the situation really was that simple. Families often wrap unreasonable expectations inside words like love, sacrifice, and loyalty. Contracts rarely do. They simply identify ownership. That evening, my father called for the first time since the closing mummer. Unlike my mother's messages, his voice sounded tired rather than angry. "Can we talk?" he asked. I invited him over, and an hour later he arrived alone. We sat in my new townhouse kitchen, drinking coffee in near silence before he finally spoke. "Your mother hasn't taken this well." I nodded gently. I noticed he stared into his cup for several moments. "She honestly believed you'd change your mind." I looked around the home I had spent months renovating without telling anyone. Fresh paint, new hardwood floors, sunlight pouring through larger windows than my old condo ever had. Everything represented years of careful planning. "Dad?" I asked quietly. "Did you believe that too?" He hesitated much longer than I expected. Finally, he admitted, "I thought you'd compromise somehow. By giving Ethan my home?" He couldn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed the spare condo key on my kitchen table. The same key my mother had handed Ethan beneath the Christmas tree now rested silently between us. "He gave it back," my father said. "He said it never should have been his." That surprised me more than anything else had all week. "How's Ethan?" I asked. My father sighed, embarrassed. We sat quietly again before he continued. "He told your mother he never asked for the condo. I believed that too. Ethan had many flaws, but I no longer believed entitlement was entirely his own creation. Sometimes the people constantly rescuing someone also teach them to expect rescue." "He's looking for work," my father added. "For real this time?" I smiled faintly. "I hope he finds something he builds himself." Over the next several weeks, my mother's version of events slowly began collapsing under its own weight. It wasn't because I argued with her. It was because facts have a habit of reaching people eventually. Aunt Carol quietly corrected relatives whenever the Christmas story came up. My cousins mentioned that they had personally watched my parents announce the condo as Ethan's gift before speaking to me. Even the building manager, Mrs. Alvarez, later confirmed to one particularly curious neighbor that no one except the legal owner had ever been authorized to access the property. Without intending to, dozens of ordinary people reconstructed the truth simply by describing what they had personally witnessed. I never posted a single explanation online. I never defended myself publicly. I simply continued living my life. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 months after Christmas, I received an unexpected text from Ethan. "Can we have lunch? Just us?" We met at a small diner halfway between our homes. He looked different than he had on Christmas morning. Leaner, quieter, less defensive. After ordering coffee, he reached into his backpack and placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a photocopy of his signed lease agreement for a modest one-bedroom apartment. "I got a job," he said. So I smiled. "Hey, man." "What kind?" "Sales support for a medical equipment distributor." "That sounds promising." "Today." He nodded. He messed. "They promoted me after 6 weeks." For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Hey." Then he looked at me. "Den, I think Mom spent so many years trying to help me." He paused. "She never realized she was teaching me not to stand on my own." I looked at my younger brother for a long moment before answering. Standing on your own feels a lot better than living in someone else's house." He smiled. "Me too. For the first time. I finally understand that." Lunch with Ethan changed something I hadn't expected. It didn't erase what happened at Christmas, and it certainly didn't repair years of unequal treatment. But it reminded me that people aren't always the same as the roles they've been assigned inside a family. Ethan had spent most of his life being the golden child because my parents insisted on making him one. That didn't excuse every bad decision he had made, but it explained why adulthood seemed to arrive later for him than it should have. Before we left the diner, he surprised me one last time. "I'm moving everything myself," he said with a small grin. "No mom, no dad, no rescue team." I laughed. "Need help?" He smiled and shook his head. "That's kind of the point." Watching him walk toward his old pickup truck, I realized this was probably the first major step he had ever taken entirely on his own. Unfortunately, my mother wasn't changing nearly as quickly. If anything, the weeks after Christmas seemed to convince her that everyone else had betrayed her rather than the other way around. She stopped attending Aunt Carol's monthly family dinners after learning several relatives disagreed with how she handled the condo. She unfriended cousins who questioned her Facebook posts. At one point, she even accused my father of taking Olivia's side simply because he refused to repeat a story he knew wasn't true. My father later admitted something that saddened me more than it surprised me. "Your mother keeps saying the family would have stayed together if you hadn't sold the condo." I looked at him quietly before asking the only question that mattered. "Dad, were we really together before any of this happened?" He didn't answer because he couldn't. Families don't become divided overnight. They usually spend years quietly avoiding conversations they should have had long ago. Spring arrived with far less drama than winter had delivered. My townhouse finally felt like home. The backyard garden began filling with flowers. Neighbors learned my name, and weekends were no longer interrupted by unexpected family requests involving Ethan's finances. One Saturday morning, I received a handwritten card from Daniel and Rebecca, the couple who had purchased my condo. In stereo were 2 photographs. The first showed the living room freshly painted with sunlight pouring through the windows I used to sit beside every Sunday afternoon. The second showed their newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in the nursery they had created from what used to be my home office. On the back, Rebecca had written a simple message: "Thank you for giving our family a place to begin." I stared at the card for several minutes. Houses change owners. Homes continue creating memories. Somehow, that thought made selling the condo feel even more worthwhile. A few weeks later, my father invited both Ethan and me to lunch without telling our mother. That detail alone revealed how complicated things had become. We met at a quiet cafe where the conversation stayed comfortably ordinary for nearly an hour. We talked about Ethan's new job, my townhouse renovations, and my father's plans for retirement. Eventually, he folded his napkin carefully and looked at both of us. "I owe you two an apology." Ethan immediately started to interrupt, but Dad raised his hand gently. "No, let me finish." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I spent years believing avoiding conflict was the same thing as keeping peace. It isn't. Every time I stayed silent because I didn't want your mother upset, I made both of you carry the consequences instead." Neither Ethan nor I spoke. We didn't need to. Some apologies don't require immediate forgiveness. They simply deserve to be heard honestly. Dad looked at me. "When your mother handed Ethan your condo keys, I should have stopped it before she finished the sentence." I nodded quietly. "Yes, you should have." Summer brought another unexpected surprise. My company promoted me to Regional Finance Director after a successful expansion project I had spent nearly a year leading. Unlike previous milestones, I didn't announce the news on social media. I simply invited a few close friends to dinner at my townhouse. Halfway through the evening, the doorbell rang. Standing outside were my father and Ethan, holding a small housewarming gift neither of them had managed to deliver months earlier. It wasn't expensive, just a handcrafted wooden serving board made by a local carpenter. Across one corner, someone had engraved 6 simple words. "Home belongs to the one who earns it." I looked at Ethan. "Yeah, you picked this," he nodded. I figured Madagascar. It fit. It did. Not because owning property made someone successful, but because respecting ownership meant respecting people. The serving board became one of my favorite items in the house. My math, not because it was beautiful for us, because it represented growth that couldn't be purchased. Late that autumn, nearly a year after the Christmas gathering, Aunt Carol organized another holiday dinner. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Conversations flowed naturally, children ran through the backyard chasing one another, and nobody argued about money or property. My mother attended too, though she remained quieter than usual. She and I exchanged polite conversation about work, recipes, and the weather. Nothing more. Some relationships don't return to what they once were. Sometimes they become something smaller, but more honest. I accepted that. Healthy boundaries aren't punishments. They're simply recognition that love works best when respect exists beside it. As everyone prepared to leave that evening, my mother walked over carrying a small, wrapped box. "This is for you," she said softly. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was the original spare key to my old condo attached to the faded keychain I had used for years. She must have found it in the kitchen drawer after Ethan returned the copy months earlier. "I know it doesn't open your house anymore," she said quietly, "but I thought you should have it." I looked at the worn key for several moments before slipping it into my coat pocket. "It opens something," I replied. "Ma?" She looked at me questioningly. What?" I smiled gently. A reminder. She nodded without asking another question. "Imva," because I think she finally understood. So, the lesson had never been about a condo. No, it had always been about permission. As Christmas approached again, I found myself thinking less about what had happened the previous year and more about how differently life felt now. My townhouse was fully furnished. The garden I planted in spring had survived its first season, and for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the quiet responsibility of solving someone else's financial problems. My weekends belonged to me again. I could spend Saturday mornings reading with a cup of coffee on the back patio, without wondering whether my phone would ring with another family emergency that somehow required my savings, my time, or my home. Peace, I discovered, wasn't exciting. It was wonderfully ordinary. One evening in early December, my father stopped by unexpectedly. He was carrying an old cardboard storage box covered with faded holiday wrapping paper. "I found this in the attic," he said. "I think it belongs to you." Inside were photo albums, elementary school report cards, Christmas ornaments I had made as a child, and dozens of handwritten birthday cards from my grandparents. Near the bottom sat a small envelope with my name written across the front in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. She had passed away years before any of this happened, yet somehow, seeing her writing again made me stop breathing for a moment. I carefully unfolded the letter inside. It wasn't long, just 3 sentences. Nade. Never let anyone convince you that loving your family means giving away your future. The people who truly love you will celebrate what you've built, not ask you to surrender it. Protect your peace as carefully as you protect your heart. I read those words twice before looking up at my father. He smiled sadly. "Your grandmother wrote that after your first paycheck," he said. "She always worried you'd spend your whole life taking care of everyone else." I laughed softly through unexpected tears. "She knew me pretty well." Dad nodded. "She also knew our family pretty well." A week later, Ethan invited me to his apartment for dinner. It was the first place he had ever rented entirely on his own, and although it was small, he had clearly taken pride in making it feel like home. There were secondhand bookshelves he had assembled himself, framed photographs from hiking trips with friends, and a tiny dining table that barely fit 4 chairs. None of it was expensive, but every piece represented something he had earned without asking our parents to rescue him. Halfway through dinner, he admitted something that surprised me. "I almost quit this job after the first month." I looked at him curiously. "Why?" He laughed. "Because my manager expected me to solve my own problems." We both smiled. Then I realized, that's what adults actually do. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, our family had agreed on something we had never done before. Instead of gathering at my parents' house, Aunt Carol offered to host everyone. She explained that a neutral location might help everyone relax. To my surprise, my mother agreed without arguing. Walking into Aunt Carol's warm, brightly decorated home felt different immediately. There were no speeches waiting to happen, no announcements disguised as gifts, and no uncomfortable expectation that one person's sacrifice would become another person's Christmas surprise. Children decorated cookies in the kitchen, while older relatives played cards in the living room. For the first time in years, the holiday actually felt peaceful. During dinner, Aunt Carol raised her glass and proposed a simple toast. "This year," she said, smiling around the table, "let's only give gifts that belong to the people giving them." Laughter spread through the room almost instantly. Even my father chuckled. My mother looked down at her plate for a moment before quietly raising her own glass. She didn't apologize publicly. She didn't explain last Christmas. She simply joined the toast. Somehow, that felt like enough. Not because everything had been repaired, but because nobody pretended the lesson hadn't been learned. Later that evening, while everyone exchanged presents, Ethan handed me a neatly wrapped package. Inside was a framed photograph of my old condo building, taken just before sunset. Beneath the picture, he had added a small engraved plaque. The place you owned. The lesson we all needed. I looked at him. Oh, you made this, he shrugged. Ma'am, I wanted to remember it the right way. I smiled. So do I. Just do that. When the evening finally ended, I walked outside into the cold December air, carrying my gifts toward my car. My father caught up with me before I reached the driveway. Olivia, I was venture. I turned. Mammy, I've been thinking about something all year. What? He looked toward the warm lights glowing through Aunt Carol's windows. Tanat, you didn't divide this family. Then he paused. So, you just stopped carrying it by yourself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I hugged him. Not because everything was perfect, but because, for the first time in a very long time, neither of us was pretending anymore. If this story reminds us of anything, it's that kindness should never require surrendering what you've honestly earned. Helping family is a choice, not an obligation created by guilt. The people who truly love you won't volunteer your future to solve someone else's problems. They'll respect your boundaries, celebrate your success, and understand that generosity only has value when it comes freely from the owner. I didn't lose a condo that Christmas. I gained something far more valuable, the confidence to protect my own life without apologizing for it. A few days after Christmas, I drove past my old condo building for the first time since the sale. It wasn't intentional. A client meeting downtown ended earlier than expected, and my navigation app chose the familiar route home. As I stopped at a traffic light, I saw the balcony where I used to drink coffee before work. The flower boxes were different now. Children's decorations hung from the windows, and a small bicycle leaned against the wall near the front entrance. Daniel and Rebecca had already turned the place into a family home. I smiled without feeling even the slightest regret. A house isn't defined by the person who used to own it. It's defined by the people building their future inside it. That same afternoon, Rebecca sent me a message with a photo attached. Their daughter had taken her first steps across the very living room where I had once unpacked moving boxes 6 years earlier. The caption simply read, "Thank you again. We think this home has been lucky for our family." I looked at the picture for a long time before replying. Take good care of it. It already has a wonderful family. Closing that conversation felt like closing the final chapter of a book I had carried around much longer than necessary. Work continued to flourish over the following year. My promotion led to new responsibilities, larger projects, and opportunities I never would have imagined when I bought that condo in my 20s. One Friday afternoon, our CEO asked me to mentor several young employees participating in the company's financial leadership program. During the first session, one of them nervously asked how I learned to make difficult decisions when family and money became complicated. I thought about the question for a moment before answering. You separate ownership from guilt. The room stayed quiet. That when you've earned something honestly, protecting it isn't selfish, it's responsible. Once you understand that difference, a lot of difficult decisions become surprisingly simple. Several people wrote those words down. I hoped they would never need them, but I was glad they had them anyway. My relationship with my parents eventually settled into something calmer than it had ever been before. We spoke regularly, celebrated birthdays together, and enjoyed ordinary family dinners without revisiting old arguments. My mother never apologized in the dramatic way movies often portray. Instead, she changed in quieter ways. She stopped volunteering my time, my money, or my belongings during conversations with relatives. When distant family members asked whether I could help someone financially, she began answering, "You'll have to ask Olivia yourself." It sounds like a small change, but to me, it represented genuine growth. Respect doesn't always arrive with speeches. Sometimes it arrives through different choices, repeated consistently over time. Ethan continued building his own life. 2 years after Christmas, he accepted a management position with the same company that had first hired him after everything happened. He proudly paid for our parents' anniversary dinner himself, refusing when my father tried to contribute. As we walked to the parking lot afterward, he smiled and nudged me with his shoulder. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "If Mom had gotten her way, I'd probably still be living in your condo." I laughed. "And you'd still be waiting for someone else to solve your next problem." He nodded. "Ma'am, instead, I learned how to solve them myself." That was worth far more than any apartment. One rainy Sunday afternoon, while organizing old paperwork in my home office, I came across the folder containing every document from the condo sale: purchase agreement, closing statement, recorded deed, title insurance. The original spare key my mother had returned rested inside the folder as well. For a brief moment, I considered throwing everything away. Then I remembered my grandmother's letter and placed it back inside the filing cabinet. Not because I wanted to remember the conflict, but because I wanted to remember the lesson. I said, "Some documents protect property. Just others protect perspective." And men, those papers had done both. A man. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether selling the condo was my way of getting revenge. The answer is no. I sold it weeks before anyone tried to give it away. I didn't make that decision to punish my family. I made it because my life was moving forward. The real turning point wasn't the sale itself. It was refusing to surrender something I had earned simply because saying no made other people uncomfortable. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, I hope you remember one thing. Family should never require you to apologize for building a life you're proud of. Love isn't measured by how much you're willing to give away under pressure. It's measured by mutual respect, honest communication, and the freedom to choose generosity instead of being forced into it. The day my parents handed my condo keys to my brother, they believed ownership could be decided by family consensus. The next morning, the law quietly reminded everyone of a much simpler truth. Only the owner gets to give the keys away. And sometimes, protecting what's yours isn't the end of a family story. I am not. It's the beginning of a healthier one.